Right, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the role of decommissioning bonds in transitioning away from fossil fuels. My name is Esau Williams. I'm from the African Leadership Centre here at King's, and I'm going to let the panelists in a moment introduce themselves. So what we're going to do this evening is discuss this title. We'll talk for about half an hour with a panel, and then we'll turn it over to you for questions. So we'll try to make this as interactive as possible. So without much ado, let's begin. And to my right, let's get an introduction, please.
Please.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. So hi, I'm Phil Dawes. I'm head of distribution at BNP Paribas Asset Management. I made that distinction because I've spent 25 years in the industry and I've spent 25 years explaining to my mother that I don't work for a bank. I work for an asset management division that happens to be bank owned. Prior to joining BNP, I was at Allianz Global Investors that was owned by Allianz, the insurance company. I can talk to you at length about what the role of asset management and the role of banks are in the energy transition, and they are distinct roles. But I'll leave it there and let my colleague perhaps introduce himself before we...
Hi, Julien Halfon. I'm also part of BNP Paribas Asset Management. I'm on what we call the solution side. Solutions is the fact that some large investors sometimes have issues that require a lot more than just buying an equity fund or a bond fund or some money market funds. We structure a solution for them. We prepare the strategy. We prepare a portfolio of investments and help them work, basically save money for the future. One type of investors is absolutely the large nuclear, oil and gas, mining, renewable, recycling companies will have long-term financial liabilities attached to what they do now. For example, people managing nuclear power plants, at one point, they will have to close the nuclear power plants and they put money aside now to be able to face the cost.
Hi everyone, I'm David Aikman. I'm a professor in the business school at King's. I run a research centre there focused on central banking. Before joining King's, I was a central banker. I also had to explain to my mum that I wasn't a real banker. So I worked in academic 17 years or so, most recently on financial regulation.
Hello, my name is Sarah Bracking. I'm a professor in the geography department, but I do study finance, green finance in particular, and how green finance can help us to a better future of ecological health and well-being. So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. And if I can start then with a question, because we won't waste a lot of time. So let me begin with you, Philip. So you do work for BNP Paribas, you do asset management. Part of BNP Paribas Group. And can you just first start by explaining sort of the different roles that these entities basically have?
Sure. So, I mean, the BNP Paribas Group in the UK is a large employer. I forget the numbers, but it's somewhere between 30,000 people across lots of different divisions. So you have the investment bank, corporate bank, you have a custodial bank, you have a real estate division, you have a car leasing division, and you have asset management. If we forget most of that for the moment, the bank is there ostensibly to lend money to corporates and to look after its corporate balance sheet, make sure its balance sheet is efficient with derivatives or looking after the custody of its assets. On the asset management side, which is why I make the distinction, is we don't hold any client money. When you come to us, we invest your money in the investment markets, whether it's equities, bonds, increasingly private assets, real assets, things like infrastructure, real estate. We will make those investments on your behalf. But very rarely do we have discretion over where we invest. So in other words, the regulator will expect us to invest where you tell us to. So if you don't want to invest in oil and gas companies, we will not invest in oil and gas companies. If you come to us and say we want to invest in the entire market, we invest you in the entire market, can include oil and gas companies. So sometimes when people look at the role of BNP in sustainability, they look at and think, oh, well, hang on, we're BNP, they hold these shares, they hold oil and gas. It can be because we're investing them passively, and that's how the client's directed us to invest their money. That being said, the group itself I would argue, is one of the more sustainable groups, one of the more sustainable banks, certainly relative to banks that we see elsewhere in the globe. So, for example, the bank has, I think, 34 billion of renewables on its balance sheet. It has 11 billion of fossil fuels on its balance sheet. So it already has 3 times the amount of money portioned to renewable projects than it does oil and gas. And those oil and gas projects will be sat on its balance sheet as a legacy of investment as they made many, many years ago. So the group itself on the banking side has stopped lending to coal, as it should. I mean, I studied at King's 30 years ago. Coal consumption has doubled since I left King's. I think it's right that the bank has stopped financing that, stopped financing oil and gas. And just generally, it has about 200 billion of money that it's directed into financial markets on its balance sheet, attributed to the transition more broadly, which also includes power, automotive sector, cement, aluminium, aviation, shipping, steel, real estate, you name it. So it's not just oil and gas. It's also how do we reinvest in circular economy? How do we reinvest in other aspects of the transition as well? So the asset management side is quite distinct from the bank, but we quite often get tarred with the same brush. So I just want to be clear that the bank itself has its own policies. And most of our policies, although if you gave us discretion, we'd probably build you a dark green portfolio. But there will be times where clients ask us, not to do that for them because they're worried about the volatility associated with some of those asset classes. So hopefully that gives some idea of what the group does and how, when we claim to be a sustainable bank and a sustainable asset manager, why we say that.
And Julian, what in English is a decommissioning fund?
Let's start with by defining both transition and decommissioning, and then I'll go short mission bomb, and trying to do that in plain English and not in jargon like Phil just did. Two things. We are in the middle of what we call a transition. What is a transition? Simply put, the way we've been producing energy, the way we've been eating, the way we've been planting things, treating the ocean, also managing our landfills and then so on and so forth, is not sustainable. So the transition is creating a world where world economy where the emissions, CO2, the consumption of actual resources is much better managed. Everything has to be better managed. We invest in renewables instead of oil and gas, for example, and stuff like fish farms, because outside of fisheries, the big issue is that there is limited resources in stock of fish. One of the biggest issues, for example, if you take the western part of Africa, it's one of the most fertile area for fish, but also there's a lot of deep drilling platform and really deep on the coast of Uganda or of Angola, for example. You have really offshore platforms that are quite polluting. So we have to make sure that the transition will go nicely. But the first step of the transition is actually to clean up what's been left. It's an interesting situation. What is cleanup? Well, imagine that you live in Battersea. A few years ago, there was a coal-fired power plant. Now it's a shopping center. It's a very, very beautiful new development, expensive apartment. This is actually a best example of decommissioning, closing down the old polluting assets, not sustainable, and creating something which is, well, somebody can argue sustainable or not, but a lot less polluting. Decommissioning is actually preparing long-term fund of the closure of those polluting assets. Same thing for nuclear power plants. You can't imagine people deciding one day that they would stop operating a nuclear power plant and leaving radioactive waste fuel in it. That's unimaginable. Nobody will accept it. I mean, there would be a revolution. And I would be potentially one of the person with a pitchfork going after the people, the electricity company, because normally what you do, you remove the radioactive waste fuel, you bury it for about 100, 150 days, and then retreat it, or some retreatment, depending which kind of, if it's plutonium or uranium, depending how you do this, you can retreat before or after. But there's a process that is extremely expensive. So the transition is getting to the new place where we are sustainable. The decommissioning is cleaning up what we have. One of the ideas that we've been pushing with Phil and other people at BNP Paribas Asset Management is that we should ask a lot of companies who are polluting now to put a lot of money aside. A bit like a pension fund. You put money aside for your retirement period. Actually, if you look at the US accounting standards, US GAAP, the obligation is called asset retirement obligation. It's the same word as for pensions. It's not only pension retirement obligation, the asset retirement obligation. Because people have been seeing this as a way to move to retire assets which are either too old, more likely to polluting, and move on to the next phase, the transition. One of the 2 or 3 ideas that's been floated around for the moment is that you fund those asset retirement pension funds. We call that decommissioning reserve funds, VRF for simplification. You can fund them out of your free cash flow. You can pay the cost of cleaning up as you go along. That's not really believable. First of all, because most of the assessment of costs were done years ago. Secondly, because the health and safety standards and the environmental standards have evolved up, meaning that what an activity, for example, cutting the top side of a drilling platform. If you go to Scotland, you see them, St. Andrews, you see them, or Aberdeen, you see them from the beach, you can see them. Cutting the top, it's called topside removal, would cost 100, probably cost 100, 20 years ago, it's probably 200 to 300 now, because the standards have changed. So if you only fund this through your cash flow, for anybody studying business, that may prove unsustainable for your company. Actually, we've been looking at a mining company, publicly available data, you can check yourself. I can give you the name, this is on our annual reports, K92 Mining, who is incapable of paying for the closure and rehabilitation of the mine they've been managing now. I don't know what's going to happen. So what are decommissioning bonds? For finish, sorry. Briefly, sorry. It's the idea that instead of issuing money, bonds, to fund your activity, you issue the money to put into the reserve fund. So for the future, you have enough money, exactly like a retirement situation. Put now money when you're young, get to the critical mass, and have money for the future.
Let me stay with you for the next question, because most people who are members of the public who are not in this sort of ecosphere often ask the question, what's in it for banks to invest heavily in decommissioning bonds or cleaning up technologies? And the question they ask is this as a result of the banks, in your case, BNP Paribas, wanting to be seen as a great corporate citizen, jumping on the bandwagon of greening? Or is there something actually that makes business sense for you to do that?
There is. I wish it was only a moral issue, but it's not. It's actually a real business issue. You want to be the next one investing in the next Amazon, the next Apple, the next Facebook, the next Instagram. They won't be in the digital media. They're probably going to be in technology related to sustainability, energy, potentially something to do with recycling, potentially fish farm, whatever it is, the next unicorn is going to come from, it's probably going to be there, because the tradition itself, depending who you take, Deloitte or McKinsey, will cost between 40 trillions and 280 trillions. So anyone who has the finger in this pie is going to eat for a long, long time really well. Not going to starve. That's one. Secondly, there's also the fact that this is not a static situation. It's not once you have everything in place, it's over. No, it's a sort of virtuous circle where the next technology will be greener than the previous one, and so on and so forth. So if you get there at the right time, there may be some leapfrogging possible, but if you get there at the right time, you, like the Silicon Valley was 40 years ago for technology, you're going to enjoy a long advantage and almost monopoly on technology for at least a generation, if not longer. So there's 2 points there. It's really a business case.
And Philip, help us. Again, we're doing lots of deconstructing of language here. Tell us the difference, or explain for us the difference between transitioning and decommissioning. They don't mean the same thing?
Well, no, I'll answer the question, but I just want to pick up on a point. So if we just to be clear, this decommissioning point, if you are in Angola or Canada and you want to open an oil and gas field, there is a legal compulsion. The regulations will insist that you pre-fund your environmental liabilities. So before you open that oil and gas platform in Angola, You have to put 100 million into an escrow account, and it's there to pay for the cleanup. Now, if you think about it, the longer that money's in the bank account, earning interest, or in our case, in reinvested in assets to earn a market return, the less you are going to have to pay at the point at which you draw the money back out to pay for the pre-fund, pay for the decommissioning of the platform. That doesn't exist in the UK. There is no legal compulsion on the part of corporates to do that in the UK. That is the point. And I feel quite strongly about this because if you look at the government and how it's trying to raise revenues at the moment to fund the transition, so I'll answer your question in a second. I feel like I'm on question time or something. The government wants money to invest in the real economy. It wants money to invest in the transition. And it's just raising taxes to do so. It doesn't need to do that. There are other pots of liabilities in this case that they could chase, as other countries have done very successfully, by the way, and indeed created sovereign wealth funds out of it, that they could use to fund the proceeds. So to answer your question, the reason that you compel these corporates to pre-fund those liabilities is because the proceeds are invested in assets which will give them a market return. Actually, it's a little bit more sophisticated than that because we'll invest them in effect in a cash flow driven investing portfolio. And that's a glorified way of saying we'll give them the money they need at the point at which they need it to take the oil platforms that were out. So 100 million on year 3, 100 million on year 7, another 100 million. We can map that out for them and give them that money in market returns. So that's one benefit, and it will minimise the amount that they have to pay as a corporate in order to take those platforms away because they're earning market return. Compound interest. That's a fair one. But what we do is one step further. So how decommissioning and transition are linked is because the actual assets we invest them in are green assets. So we take $1 billion from the corporate. We maybe take $1 billion from the bank as a decommissioning bond. We give it to the corporate. We take it off the corporate. We put it in a decommissioning reserve. We invest it in assets for them. We invest them in renewables. We invest them in green buildings. We invest them in solar. It might be VC. It might be forestry. It might be natural capital. Whole suite of different asset classes. Now, if you think from the government's perspective, what it's now done, it's got $1 billion in reserve that's there to clean up the oil and gas, in this example, platforms when they need to be decommissioned. But it's also invested in the meantime $1 billion in green assets, which is earning a return and has just built some solar plants, some green. It's a win-win. It hasn't cost the taxpayer any money, but it has led to investment in the transition. So that's it simply, it's a win-win for the corporate and for the government. I'll leave it there for a minute.
Maybe just to
Very briefly.
yeah, no, just to this is not science fiction. This is what's happening. If you go to the website of ETF, the French, which is the French utility energy company, they have 37 billion in their decommissioning fund. And you look at what they invest in, 25% is in renewable. They're already doing. We're working with them. It's not a secret. We have a lot of companies doing this, and we're working with other. I'm sorry, they're confidential. Other stakeholders, different sectors, doing exactly the same thing. At the same time, we cleaning up and preparing the future. This is what's happening. This is real. This is not. We're not talking about what we would like to do. 10 years ago, when this was conceptualized, it was science fiction. Now, no, we're there.
So also, do you find this sort of a victim of its own success in the sense that when you say, for example, invest in a company that decides to build lots of wind farms, for example, that later on, when it comes to recycling, I mean, I've heard and you tell us that it's difficult to recycle the entire wind farm, that some parts of it do not degrade, could pose other problems.
Yes, this one of an issue is that if you look at the technology for wind farms, it's changed radically in the last 20 years. First of all, we are getting more and more sophisticated at managing complex energy, alternative energy systems. But also, if you look at the latest version of windmills, you will see they have nothing to do with windmills. I don't even know why they call them windmills. But that means that the old ones will have to be one way or the other retired. And so far, the big issue is that a lot of the components, especially the blades, are built using composite material, some very sophisticated stuff. they're very light, they're very specific, and they are not really recyclable. That's really one big issue. So people have been burying literally on the ground some of the components. So one of the jokes that's been going around is 200 years from now, archaeologists will start to dig and find blades from windmills, really weird. But at one point, we know that, well, we already know that technologies that we can use was a bit expensive. We can recycle 95%, but really complicated because they're really superconductor composite elements. We can charge them like batteries, but they're a bit complicated because they create their own gravitational field, and they tend to, one charge, tend to go literally leave the atmosphere. It's really dangerous. So we have to chain them to the floor. It's really strange. But this is where we are in reality. It's what people do in the transition. We're creating new technologies. We are really out of this world when you look in practice. But people are doing it. It's actually a listed company who does that. It's not even a VC or a lab. It's actually people doing it as a company listed on the Nasdaq. So the world in which we're living is getting stranger and stranger, but it's the only way for us to progress, to clean up the planet.
And Philip, if I could come to you, you talked a little earlier about decommissioning, the difference between that and transitioning. And I'm more interested in also the areas of the sectors that are most impacted.
Well, we wrote a paper which was published a couple of years ago, which we've since edited, and has a database that sits behind. And we analysed mining. Well, it's pretty much the list of sectors that I gave you earlier, actually. I mean, the transition, impacts all sectors, but just looking at the mining sector in terms of decommissioning, the mining sector, oil and gas, nuclear, utilities, power, we got to $8 trillion globally of assets that need to be decommissioned. Now, we also know that that is understated. We know it's understated because if you think about an oil and gas company that has a 49% JV in an oil field, it doesn't consolidate them in its balance sheet.
Sorry, what's JV?
Joint venture.
Okay.
And so when you look at the holdings of an oil and gas company or a mining company, they own slices of these projects all around the world. They therefore don't have to report them in the report and account. So they're very open. When you go and speak to a company, let's sorry, I nearly said it. Speak to a company, they have reportedly $18 billion of decommissioning liabilities. They're very open, it's 50. So the biggest sectors, mining, oil and gas, nuclear, but it also, as you just highlighted, it impacts renewables. It impacts all of these sectors to some degree, but the big ones are, we all know mining's an obvious one. There are hundreds of mines that need to be remediated that are currently leaching pollutants into watercourses, the problems with tailings, problems with flooding in areas. It's appalling, and they know it needs to be cleaned up, but there's no legal compulsion on them to do it necessarily.
If you look at the US, fracking has been a big problem. Do you know how many wells, which are pretty much mines like vertical? 3 million, and they're leaking methane, which is one of the worst gas to leak in the atmosphere, by the way. 3 million wells. This is unimaginable. The cost will around 400, 500 billions to clean. That's the number. It's part of the 8 trillion. We know that Canada has signed plenty of them. At least Canada is forcing people to say, okay, it's nice to have letter of credit or some guarantee. No, we want cash now. This is what Australia has done, South Africa, and all up Nigeria, Ghana. A lot of people have decided it was enough. Chile, Argentina say now it's nice, you're polluting it, it's enough. You're putting money in a bank or an escrow account or a trust. In the US, the nuclear sector, for each reactor, you have a decommissioning trust fund. It's really like a pension fund at that point. It's pretty much the same thing attached to it. And when you buy and sell the nuclear reactor, you have the right in the US. You transfer the ownership of the trust to the actor.
Okay, we're almost at the halfway point of, I was going to say the program, but it's not the program. It's the lecture or the discussion. So let me bring in David. You've been taking notes, so apparently you have a thing or two to say, I suspect.
Well, I'm kind of interested. It sounds from the way you're both speaking, you've made this to be a legal requirement in the UK. That's the first question, just to be crystal clear.
I think if you use the oil and gas sector as an example, only last week we were speaking to some representatives of the government. Again, don't want to say who they were.
We have brains here, you can tell us.
Yes. And we were speaking to, and we've spoken to the North Sea Oil and Gas Authority for many, many years. We've spoken to Treasury. Basically, they will not put they're falling back on what they call Section 29. If you're an oil and gas company, I sell it to you, you go bust, you have an environmental liability, your liability comes back to me. That's what they rely on. Now, if you think about that in the context of the North Sea, where most mature enhanced oil fields are now operated by private equity firms. So what that means is you've got quite a dangerous situation where the companies are probably never going to pay. And those liabilities are probably going to go back to a number of, probably 5 companies. It's going to be Conoco, Phillips, Exxon, BP, Shell. We know who Total, maybe. We know who they are. Good luck. A, hoping that they're still solvent when you try and go to them for the money. But B, secondly, good luck trying to get them to pay for it. So we would favour some form of legal compulsion, but I think we will be waiting a very, very long time for that to happen. But what we have also said to them is, don't, because they recognise it was a mistake several decades ago, don't make the same mistake with renewables.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't make the same mistake with these other sectors. But it's like talking to a brick wall.
So there's a legacy problem, and then you pointed to.
There's a legacy problem which they're going to come down.
Yeah, I guess the other question I've got is about the incentives to issue these particular types of bonds. So with a green bond, there's an idea of a greenium, which means you get a slightly lower interest rates if you issue a green bond compared to a traditional bond. Is there the same kind of concept, I suppose, with these?
Yes, on steroids.
On
Yeah,
steroids.
literally. Imagine a bond. People can buy that bond. Could be issued by state, could be issued by a corporate. That money that's going to be raised through the bond, we put into a fund whose end game is to clean up a mess. It's already positive. You know that you're going to go from something with polluting to something with zero. So at least no pollution. Potentially, that bond will be also used to redevelop assets, green assets, like Battersea Power Station or the Tech Model. We have 2 examples within London. You can see this, that they closed coal-fired power plants, one of the most polluting way of producing electricity you can imagine. And they now have a museum and a shopping center. I'm not saying it's the best thing in the world, but it's a lot better than it was. Or even better, in some cases, this is what happens in North America. It's a mine, you close the mine, and on top of the area to be rehabilitated, you do a solar farm. So you move from brown assets, polluting assets, to zero to green. That's already the end game. But even better, those proceeds of the bonds for the time before you have to close and redevelop, clean and redevelop, can be invested, as Phil said, described, into green assets themselves. They are the things you will invest in the meantime. For example, you buy a solar farm, which is going to give you a nice return, 5, 6, 7% a year, up to the point where you need the money. So you can do good on day one. It's not a moral issue here. It's as I discussed, it's a very profitable business. You prioritize the entire system. So the greenium is not specifically identified. It's the entire process. The entire value chain is green. And I used to call that green lean killing machine. In some ways, you kill all the brown assets and invest by investing in green bonds or decommissioning bonds. That's what they do.
I mean, there is a slight skepticism amongst the people who buy these bonds, because investors will say, well, why should I buy them? I'm getting a lower interest rate. Why should? But actually, if you think about some of these sectors, hard to abate sectors, or some of the sectors we've discussed, a lot of these investors actually have no exposure. So because they've excluded them from their portfolio. But what they will do, and they will buy them, these bonds, and actually they're queuing up to buy these bonds.
Yes.
And literally queuing up to buy them, because they want to help transition these sectors. But what they won't do is buy just a general corporate bond from Anglo-American or whoever it may be,
Yeah.
because it's not specific enough that the proceeds could be used to open another mine. Whereas these decommissioning bonds are very, very site-specific and very, very asset-specific. So they would buy them because it gives them exposure to a sector that they haven't got in their portfolio. Is one reason.
Right, and if I can sort of break the male monotony here, and turn to Sarah for this one, I want to get your view, Sarah, about what you think that the impact of decommissioning bonds on the social and economic aspects of a just transition.
I drafted this question and I realised it was actually really hard. Because obviously decommissioning the dirty asset is, the boat that gets us to the shore where we can have a different type of a future. But there is still a problem of responsibility between government, communities and the private sector around what happens to workers and communities. So the cleanup is obviously going to benefit proximate communities and people using that environment for farming or agriculture or something. The actual workers, and I know Thomas said something about this, there is an issue about whether they should be given retraining, reskilling. And I know in South Africa, they're in the Just Transition Economic Plan, they do have some money put aside to retrain coal miners, although the footprint of that is very small at the moment. I think the Nuclear Authority in the UK does have a remit to also look at workers and pension funds and a social remit, but I don't think banks do so much.
Well, we do. Nuclear is an interesting situation because for a number of years, at least for the entire generation, we thought that we would never build new nuclear power plants. From roughly the late 80s, early 90s to now, there was almost not a ban, but there was not. We thought it would never happen. I mean, some countries like Germany came out of nuclear completely, and we lost a lot of know-how. So actually, we tried to retrain our engineers to call back a lot of people who have been enjoying retirement, in France in particular, to take care of the nuclear power plants. In France, half the 34, 35 nuclear power plants are out of order. So they really have, you bringing people back to try to fix them. But you have a case actually in Canada, Extrata, there's been the company, is mining company, been bought by Glencore, and will not call Glencore, probably not the type of company we do business with for other reasons. I'll let you look at the profile online if you want to. But the Extrata was actually an extremely sophisticated company, and they took a blue sky mine, means open mine, turned it into a natural reserve, an eco park, with an eco hotel. They trained the miners to become park rangers and staff of the hotel. So actually, those ideas of turning brown assets into green stuff, they work pretty well. You have plenty of jobs. It's not something that's going to kill the employment. If you want to see what's happening in other mining cases in the US, they build data centers on all former mining sites. It happens everywhere. Really also quite interesting. You have people actually build the data centers, that gives job to engineers, but also construction workers, and people maintain them. It's usually a bit out of the way, it's middle of nowhere, but there's jobs being created. So no, the transition is not killing jobs, actually creating new jobs that nobody thought of. I mean, I don't know if you've seen, we've been discussing a lot about whaling. The whaling industry is left with like 4 countries in the world, I think Japan, Iceland, I think Australia, and I don't know which one, which one? I think, this really strange country, maybe Finland, I don't know. There's a weird country that nobody expected us whaling, but most of the whaling industry has changed. Now they are whale sites. I mean, they're sighting whales. They take tourists on boats and try to see the whales instead of killing them. I think it's a progress, for personally, as far as I'm concerned. But the same thing is happening in mining and other industries.
Good. So I think this is an opportune moment now to hand the microphones over to you. So let's hear any questions. We're warmly welcome. Well, I can keep asking mine. Yes.
Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. We talked about the just energy transition and the work that's happening in South Africa. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about this, how the just energy transition partnerships are doing, and if they are a key to unlock some of the decommissioning.
So,
Yeah, the South African one, I think is going slightly slowly. Comanche closed. I don't think the community rehabilitation scheme has had much energy. And then there's another 3 coal-fired power stations that are due to be closed in the NDC for South Africa. But the planning for that seems to be slightly stalled. I mean, my issue with South Africa is not the fact that everyone's talking about the future, so much as the issues that have been raised here about there being, say, 2,000 mines where the government can't trace the beneficial owners, many of which are leaching, or say Somkhele coal mine in Tendale coal mine in Somkhele, where Glencore left it and sold it out to a private equity firm, but they were mining for 10 years without even a water license. I mean, the pollution around that is terrible. So I think I don't think the South African government has made enough effort to force cleanups. I mean, I know it hasn't. And that applies to past assets as well as new ones. And I don't think there is a plan to provide the types of employment that people need for basically 2 million coal mining workers, which is why the Coal Mining Union has decided that climate change is a plot and that the green transition is just a European scam, which is unfortunate because we've actually lost the coalition that would make a green transition in South Africa.
Big announcements around COP26 around this partnership.
Yeah, so yeah.
Just before, yeah.
Good afternoon, Ivan from KCR Geography. Would like to ask about if we go back to just energy transition, because Donald Trump withdrew the US commitments. It's very obvious with that, especially with his policy, and that puts developing countries like South Africa, Indonesia, or these countries that are highly reliant on coal on a knife edge, especially with significant coal interests in governments and businesses in these sorts of countries. Would like to ask, how would the climate finance mechanism address the climate finance gap to move these countries away from coal and move these countries from the financial dependency and lobby dependency of the fossil fuel industry? Thank you.
Julien.
That's an excellent question. So as a background, I used to work for the European Commission and the French government in development. I worked a lot with Uganda. I did a lot of work in Benin and other countries. And one of our clients is working a lot in Gabon, for example. 2 things. First of all, the US is not the only country providing support to many of those countries. Actually, Europe, through European Union and bilateral aid, does a lot more. So that's not a problem. Secondly, if you look at what's happening in some countries like Rwanda, where plastic has been almost completely banned, they take some of the countries
completely banned?
plastic bags. Yeah. So some of the decisions are made locally, and they're very effective. Believe me, works really well. Invading your neighbor is probably not a good idea, but for the rest of it. Some countries, for example, Morocco, are developing one of the largest solar panel development ever. I mean, it's only a quarter now. I think it's the 3rd largest, and it's going to be, when it's finished, it's going to be the largest. So they didn't wait for Trump to do any of those things. And if you go back to 2016, 2020, first Trump mandate, because he stopped some of the aid at the national level and the US federal level, a lot of the cities and states took over. It would be surprising to learn that the state in the US, which has the highest component of renewables in its energy portfolio, is Texas. It's really interesting is that you get in situations which are completely paradoxical. So some people, even in the red states, are not that convinced of what to stop this. So even if, now there's a couple of things you have to know in Africa, especially on the western seaboard. A lot of the energy is produced by dams, also hydroelectricity. So there is coal, but there's plenty of those things. So it's frankly, it's not the continent that pollutes the most. Compared to Asia and North America, it's really not Europe. It's not really pollution at this level. It's not this. I mean, some of the rivers are polluted for other reasons. It has nothing to do with CO2 emission. It's not good grades. The cars are everywhere else, but it's not a specifically big problem compared to other continents. Second, lastly, you see in technology, the first place in the world where phones were really used for payments was Africa. There was a leapfrog that because of the really bad networks, banking networks, so they said, okay, let's do this. And now you can pay with WhatsApp, not more efficiently that we do here. So see, it's not always clear what's going to be the technological solution that would be winning in the end. I can tell you something we tell our clients, and it's what we're working with clients to create portfolios of transition technologies. They buy this. I'm telling them, I don't know which one is going to win, which technology is going to win in the future. But at least with me, you're going to lose your money a bit slower because you can diversify the risks. But exactly what we're trying to do, to give them exposure to stuff they're going to win next time. So yes, Africa, on paper, now in reality, the stuff are very different. You look at a lot of successes in places that you would not expect.
I thank you for the session, Geography Department, Kings. So that's a question in regards to how does the bank, BNP Paribas, right, integrate ESG considerations into investments into critical minerals? Sorry, with this like energy transition and stuff. I want to know like what are the environmental and social safeguards that you implement in your investment decision making?
The ESG policies.
Policies, yes, and particularly in regards to critical minerals. I mean, we know how it happens in Chile, Bolivia, DRC, so and now maybe in Greenland. So what are your policies? How you actually approach this question?
I can answer from a general standpoint on critical minerals. I don't know if you do.
No, it's the banks, so the lending. We're two different companies in reality. We are the same holding company, and frankly, I'm not really aware of all the details. But they have what I can answer is that they have a policy that stuff which are lithium, for example, is one of the minerals that we need for the batteries and a lot of the transition. That would be positive. Fracking is completely out of the question. They're not going to fund this. That's not going to happen. E&P exploration and production is not funded, but extraction of other copper, for example, which we need also, it's actually supported. So I don't know much more than that. I can also tell you that in the M&A team there, they already created what they call a low carbon transition team that does all the M&A. So they buy clean assets for their clients. It's one of the stuff they do. But I cannot tell you more than that because as I said, we're not in the same place. Actually, to be able to get the answer, I need to be what they call wall crossed. I have to go to the other side of the wall. It's called the Chinese wall. It's where the information are not allowed to circulate. And then I will not be able to tell you anything, otherwise I will have to kill you. Not just kidding.
More generally, the bank's CSR policy is quite strict relative to other banks. So, as I said earlier, it pulled out of coal, financing coal a long time ago. Oil and gas, last E&P project financed was, I think, 8-9 years ago. And it's pulling out of things that it sees contentious. With regard to specific minerals, I don't know. On the asset management side, again, it comes back to we have a sustainability centre, and every single investment we make goes through that sustainability centre, and we assess them for their environmental, social, governance impact, including private markets. So there's an example where you mentioned investing in companies that buy wind farms, and so we're actually buying wind farms. So we're buying the actual asset itself, and even there we will be doing an assessment, an ESG assessment of each and every private asset that we buy. So an example will be we were approached to fund a refinery. We said no, not interested. It's not consistent with our ESG policies, so we refused to fund it. I tell you, did.
Yeah, did.
Maybe one follow-up question, provocative follow-up question to be interesting. To what extent is this true? So if a bank like BNP Paribas decides to step away from fossil fuel assets as you were describing, they're basically just being financed elsewhere in the financial system in a way that's kind of harder to actually see. So private equity or other private funds where you kind of have less regulatory scrutiny. Is that kind of a fair concern?
For me, I would say yes, it is. I'll let Julian jump in on this as well. But yeah, for me, I would say yes, it is. I mean, I'll answer your question. I mean, the interesting point about, Trump's drill, baby, drill. I mean, almost irrespective of what BNP does. I mean, we're a big bank, right? I mean, we've got 200 billion of transaction assets on our balance sheet. We move money around, but Trump's statements move in the market. So we have to remember that the finance is one actor in this system that can be superseded by government legislation and regulations. It can be superseded by one, I was going to say politician, is that the word?
President's comment.
One president. Julian.
Yes, at the same time, I think the latest numbers from the non-farm payroll in the US showing that energy and the car manufacturing companies have been laying off. So we don't know exactly why. Maybe they're expecting a recession. So Trump may say drill, baby, drill, whatever they want. But if the prices are going to go down, and usually when you have a recession, oil prices are going to be the first affected. They've already gone down slightly. If the Saudis start to really pump a lot of oil on their side, this thing is going to go down fast. And if that happens, on the positive side, inflation is going to go up. On the positive side, people are not going to feel more because that will just make this matter even worse. So, by the way, just an interesting thing is that in history, each time people are saying, look, the prices are high in 73, 74, 79, 80, 2006, 2006, 7, 2005, 6, 7, 8. Each time the prices of oil and gas have been very high for a long time, people are starting to drill too much and they collapse right after that. Maybe this time it's going to be different, I don't know. But for those of you who are studying economics and or geography or resources, you can check this. The prices have pretty much been staying at $70 a barrel, roughly between 70 and 80. That's a bit high, even though if you put them in terms of 1973 prices, if you decide to go back to before the first oil shock, you will realize it's not that high. We're probably at $15 a barrel. The time it was $4, so it's not an enormous increase. But each time we do this, that's not a good idea. And the oil companies are well aware of it.
Okay. I'm really aware we've got about 10 minutes left. The gentleman in the coach has got a question.
Yes, thank you so much. I would like to hear your thoughts on the role of supervisors and central banks. Maybe in general role or what repercussions are you facing at the moment from your supervisors, or maybe more as a devil's advocate version of the question, what should they do to regulate you or to supervise you in this domain?
Philip, want to take up?
Again, we're not here to represent the bank.
Let's go ahead.
It's a former central banker. I should say central bank. I think what supervisors can do is actually quite limited here. So the primary job of a central bank or financial regulator is basically to prevent systemic risk. It's to prevent a financial crisis of the sort we had in 2008. That's like mandate number one. Now they do have some tools that can be used to kind of move the needle a little bit in this direction, capital requirements, different other types of prudential rules, but they're not powerful compared to the tools that governments have. So changing tax policies, or the thing we were talking about earlier, mandating the issuance of some of these bonds, that's a completely different order of magnitude. And you can see that with the Biden IRA Act before he left office. That had a much more powerful effect than anything a central bank could do in this area. So I think it's a mistake to be looking for central banks to take in the lead.
But the GFS is sympathetic, but let's not waste our time on it.
I'm not saying these things are pointless, but I think we don't put any hopes on this.
Thank you.
You have to see that the reserve of central banks are not that big. If you look at them, all of them in Europe, it's a couple of $100 billion per central bank. That's nothing. There's often it's a more medium-sized pension fund in each of the country, which is bigger than that. So that's why it's one pension fund. I mean, if you take the entire defined benefit pension market in the UK, is 2.5 trillion. It's like massively bigger than the result of the Bank of England. If you add the defined contribution and health savings, we're talking about, I think, 4.5 trillion, which is, if you get those guys to move, that will have an impact, not the few hundred billion.
Lady for that.
Thank you. I'm wondering about the kind of centrality of power purchase agreements in a lot of decommissioning debates and questions around whether, or in a lot of the transition debates I had with co-dependent countries, the PPA renegotiation was a very central problem that a lot of the actors within that who wanted to decommission power plants faced. How much do we, in addition to renegotiating the existing PPAs, also need to change the liability infrastructure of the fossil fuel industry, or kind of their increase in liabilities that they'll have to accept given their kind of knowingly producing an unwanted product or a future non-resilient product? And how much of that is being discussed at the moment in terms of facing more liability?
Just one thing. I used to work in 8 or 10 years of my life. I managed projects in multiple countries. I'm very, very skeptical to go and giving an aid program to Saudi Arabia or Qatar. Let's say it's okay, we have an agreement with them for the prices. When they run out, they have massive reserves, they should be able to do it themselves. For countries like Chile, will have really issues, Gabon, maybe Nigeria, then we can have real discussions. But you have to see that those countries which have big reserves should have put the money aside and for years and years. If they haven't done it, it would be really weird now to go and have. We've been transferring part of our GDP, 2 or 3% a year, to those countries since at least the 60s. So I'm of two minds on this. It's my personal opinion. I'm not representing BNP when I say that, but that would be really strange.
Yep, strong there. We need shorter answers so we can accommodate them in 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm a PhD in political economy here at King's. We haven't really touched upon this, but I was wondering, the relationship that asset managers and in general, not only your group, could have with governments. As we said, the IRA has been a big player here, and there's a lot of talking about how de-risking and creating guarantees could help increase the participation of private markets in investing in critical technologies, for example, in Europe. At the same time, there's been 2022 a lot of financial tightening, and then we've had energy crisis and a lot of interest more in defense. So I was wondering what you think of these programs, where it's going in your opinion, also in terms of really, thinking that they could deliver, because I think that on the side of the regulators and the governments, there's a bit of a changing of mood on these programs.
Well, do you want to take us down?
Yeah, there's about 12 questions in funny enough, I was on a call this morning with the Investment Association, which is the trade association of the asset management industry, and all of those questions cropped up. Me personally, I'm slightly sceptical that it's one of the reasons that we're here today to explain that government doesn't need to focus ostensibly on DB and DC pensions in order to finance the energy transition. There are other sources of capital, and I'm slightly sceptical that that money will flow, even if they decide the National Wealth Fund is going to put up some guarantees on specific projects. But this isn't a capital issue. There's not a lack of capital. They're focusing on the wrong things. And so what shocked me when we did meet with Desnes is their constant sort of focus on carbon storage as the big solution going forward. I'm quite sceptical about carbon storage. I think it's unproven. I think it'll cost. I think it's a bit of a white elephant. It looks good if you put your white helmet on and you stand in front of the cameras.
It's quite expensive too.
It would be very expensive, and it may ultimately, it may just be better to stop emitting carbon. I mean, it's that simple. So I don't know if we're going to answer your question, because I do think it's not a lack of capital. There's not a lack of capital here. I think the government needs to have a coordinated policy on what it wants to achieve, where it wants to do it in terms of levelling up, and the capital will follow. Just stop moving the goalposts. Stop changing pension regulations every 10 minutes. Stop changing your policy every 10 minutes. We need some consistency, and the capital will come in for sure. It's there.
Julien, do you want to say something quickly?
No, I think that's a.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Sophie Marginak from the Polluter Pays project. I've got two questions. The first is around the decommissioning relief funds that you establish. I'm just wondering how you can guarantee, or potentially the bank can help to ensure that the funds are eventually spent on decommissioning, because obviously those funds will be in the control of the companies, and it may come to a point down the road where they do need that 50 million bill comes due, and the executives decide that they prefer to spend that on dividends or creditors or paying their executives. So is there a private law solution that you have to try and guarantee that the DRFs are spent in the right way? And then if not, is there some kind of regulatory solution or amendment that you might suggest to set up this pension fund for decommissioning, and what might that be?
So I'll literally jump in. So there's two aspects of that. Decommissioning reserve itself, I think it's better the corporate put some money up than nothing. Even if it then decided it was going to spend it on something else because it needed it, then that's a slightly different. If it's a decommissioning bond, then I absolutely agree with you, because no one's going to buy a decommissioning bond if the KPIs linked to that bond are then not sort of guaranteed that the process.
Key performance indicators.
Key performance indicators, sorry. And so I agree with you, when it comes to decommissioning bonds, they have to be very, very tightly defined. It's one of the reasons why I'd like to see the government issue one, because they may well not change the law when it comes to legal compulsion of these environmental liabilities. But they do have a funding requirement in whether it's Port Talbot or the Teesside, or these levelling up sort of pockets where they want to create these green energy hubs. Just issue a decommissioning bond, which decommissions all the old assets, cleans it up, and then creates the green hub. It's exactly what we've been saying. And so they themselves could issue a decommissioning bond and set the standard for those KPIs. That's what we're asking them to do, rather than actually change the law, because they won't do that. They've made that very clear. I agree with you.
Going back to the first questions, there are multiple ways to ensure that the money goes where it's intended to go. You create trust with independent directors. That's clear. The money is out of reach of the directors of the company, so it's not. You put on escrow accounts. Those two methods have been used in multiple places. Angola is using escrow accounts, nuclear in the US and in the UK use trust. The Lapis Fund based in Edinburgh deals with 14 billion. Or you create literally a separate asset management company in France. It's called EDF Invest for the decommissioning purposes. So you have dedicated vehicles that can keep the money safe from grabbing hands, and God knows there are going to be plenty of them. That's one. The second point I'd like to mention is that this is not a choice. We will not be able to move forward if we leave nuclear power plants lying around. We know that. Same thing for drilling platforms, offshore drilling platforms in the North Sea. You can see them from the shore in Scotland. They're there. It's like some of them fell in the sea, nobody cares, but they do. They pollute. They can also create masses. But if they were used, if you go to California, which almost finished the decommissioning of the entire coast, they used to create natural reserves for fish. Works really well. Hotels, diving platforms, tourism is actually being increased thanks to the redevelopment. So it's not only that those reserves that you create will have to be dedicated and really bring friends to clean up, is that you know that in the end, if you do stuff well, you will benefit. So there's the big stick, you know, but there's also a huge carrot. So the two things work hand in hand.
What else? Oh, yeah, please.
Can I ask one more, maybe more provocative question to the ex-central banker? On the 8 trillion, if there's apparently If 8 trillion is an underestimate of this decommissioning cost, is that potentially a systemic risk that ought to be considered by central banks?
Just to be clear, because David didn't write the paper, the 8 trillion is global, so we'd have to disaggregate. So I don't know what the proportion would be in the UK, but
It's 200. 100. Sorry, depending on you calculate between 100 and 200, because depending on how you calculate nuclear in the UK. So it's difficult to know. And some of the UK companies, big oil and gas and mining companies, file their annual report in the UK, but some of the liabilities have nothing to do with the UK. Could be a mining company, BHP, for example, could be in Australia or South Africa, but it's aggregated. It's something that most impossible to check. But it's between 100 and 200 billion for the UK, roughly, depending on calculation. It's what it is.
Thanks. No, I think it's a really good question. I mean, central banks have been worried about stranded assets as a potential source of systemic risk, and this is in the same kind of thing. And I think really the question you have to ask is who's holding the exposures? So are there any levered entities that are exposed to that risk? If it's kind of real money investors, it wouldn't really be a source of financial instability. Sure, people will lose some money potentially, but that's on those they can provision for it. But if it's people with leverage who are not expecting, or if the losses turn out to be a lot bigger and more suddenly people are expecting that. Yeah.
Anyone else? So the lady at the very end. The blue sweater. I saw your hand half up.
Hi, I'm a PhD student from DBE. I'm wondering, while most of the profitable sustainable tech companies are pushed by policies, and how would you think the current situation related to security, related to policy changes, would favor the development of sustainable techs? And then in relation to the maturity and to the profitability of decommissioning bond in competition with other bonds, because according to the current rate of the decommissioning bonds, it seems like it's not very competitive in profitability. Thanks.
Julian?
I can start. There's an old economist, well, monetary economist used to say that bad mortgages is good. We know the theories from the 18th century and let's say mid-18th century. That's one reason, by the way, that Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations, is because he was observing the failure of some banks in Scotland, and he came to London to actually find ways to save whatever was left of the banks. Air Bank, Arm Bank, I don't remember the other two, but it was one of the reasons. Here you have a kind of similar situation. You have bad ideas that have been winning when it comes to decommissioning and transition, meaning we're going to pay that out of free cash flow. But we know that the numbers that have been put on the balance sheets are not the real ones. People are not lying. They are not yet recognizing the massive change in environmental standards, health and safety standards, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the balance sheet of the big mining companies, they doubled in the last 10 years the exposures. They didn't increase twice the capacity. They actually recognize more and more of the past. They say, okay, the legacy stuff are more expensive than we expected. So I think that at one point we'll have to choose good money, bad money. We'll have to choose what instruments we're going to use to clean up the planet. I do believe that if for the moment the decommissioning bonds have not been as successful as we're hoping, and it's so debatable, because if you look at EDF, we know that part of the funding EDF has gone into the decommissioning fund. So they used traditional bonds to fund themselves, but they didn't use decommissioning bonds. They decided differently. But if we agree that it's not been as successful, it's also because I think we haven't yet faced the real issue. It's when the moment will come. If you look at the numbers, even 8 trillion, if you compare to the assessment from the law to 40 trillion, that's already increased by 20% the cost of the transition. If you add this 8 trillion, which is not included in the transition assessment of Deloitte. If you look at the 300 trillion, let's say, or 275 from McKinsey, it's 3%. It's fine, potentially it's not. But if it's not 8, as we suspect, but more, somewhere anywhere between 20 and 30, or more than that, suddenly the cost is so high that we will have to find new solutions. At that moment, I'm hoping at that moment, the good money will chase the bad one. At that moment, I'm hoping that really people say, okay, we need an instrument, a vehicle that ensures that the money from the savers, from the retirement system, the pension fund goes to clean up the planet in an effective way, fully dedicated, fully protected from anyone trying to redirect the funds, and in a very virtuous way, investing in green assets. We call dark green, extremely green assets, for example, renewables and stuff like that. That's the hope we have. I've been working on this for, I'm older than you think, 10 years easily. Otherwise, I really started on the nuclear in 98 at the European Commission. So I've been, can say, 27 years looking at problems with decommissioning in general. I worked on, for example, on the Chernobyl massive concrete coffin, stuff like that. And at the time, people didn't know where the money was going. We have choices now. We have ways to do it properly. I'm hoping people will make the right choice and use the good instruments rather than the bad ones. But one can only hope.
Has he answered your question? If you want to ask it again, go ahead. If you want to clarify your question or get him to be more succinct.
To that point, I will pass it to
Okay, I think it was gentleman the blue, and then
At the outset, thank you so much for the talk. It is pretty eye-opening about how the state of finance going forward. I'm Sai, a recent King's alumni, and my question is, at the beginning of the conversation, we talked about sovereign wealth funds. I would like to talk more about sovereign green bonds and how do you feel that that sort of ties into this energy transition? How is BNP looking at in the investment of sovereign green bonds, particularly in Asia or wherever you have seen, because that's a sort of new concept which has been going around the past few years. I think I would like if you guys could elaborate more on that.
Hello.
Sarah.
Oh, sorry.
No.
They've been going a while. 2008 was the first World Bank EIB ones, but the sovereign ones came in from the 2012 onwards. The UK one, Glasgow, there was a lot of fanfare about that, but so far, a lot of it isn't actually expended. And my problem with the UK sovereign green bond is that there's no legal obligation to spend it on classified green entities. You can just transfer it over to generalised government debt, which there's a big pile of it. And also the implementation or the expenditure so far has been sort of tied up in Whitehall with deciding what to do with it and what is climate change adaptation and what is, whether you can add in agriculture and flood resilience, and just having a litigable sort of, a government category of what is a green thing has rather consumed them, I think, for about 5 years. Other places have done more. I mean, some of the ones in the global south have funded electric buses in places like Johannesburg and Rio, and I think Lagos. Although I might have to check on that. Most go to energy and transport, and they're a very good idea, actually. They're a brilliant idea. I mean, if our government could get together with the infrastructure bank and maybe government pension funds and allow municipal or big councils to leverage their pension funds, then we could have more green bond lending that would actually do something about climate change adaptation. Because at the moment we're not doing very much at all.
It's one of the reasons why I was saying we've got a lot of investors queuing up to buy these decommissioning bonds, because they are, unlike the definition of the green bonds, they are super rigid in the way the proceeds of them would be used. So that's why we would encourage the government to look at a definition of green. I mean, they are in fact looking at the definition of the green bond, and they are looking at whether nuclear, for example, is part of the energy transition going forward, and the use of SMRs and so on around the UK. But it's also the case that it's part of the frustration is that you've got a lot of government departments chasing the proceeds from this. So you've got DEFRA, you've got DESMES, you've got all these different departments that are basically wanting to spend the proceeds of these bonds, all competing with each other to try and spend the money. So it comes back to the point I made that having some form of having a vision and a policy and sticking to it and see if it works, because at the moment it just feels as though we're sort of throwing mud at the wall to see what sticks, and I don't think that's a policy.
And just very quickly, I mean, I just wonder what kinds of conversations or what's the discourse like with governments. I mean, you've got politicians on one hand who are chasing opinion polling and making political decisions on environmental issues that keep them in office. And then here you are, the experts, with the information and saying, well, this is what you ought to do. The policy needs to stay fixed, and it keeps changing. How does that discussion go?
Well, let me answer you in a slightly oblique way and see if it answers the question. So when you're speaking to a CFO and you talk about the economic rationale for decommissioning and how much money you can save them and how it's going to enhance their ESG profile and how you reintroduce and diversify their investor base because people will start buying the decommissioning bonds, all great things, he's not interested because he's got a 3-year window to deliver to his shareholders and maximize value. And he thinks, if I've got cash, I should open another mine. I should open another oil and gas platform. So when we're talking to CFOs, the discourse is not dissimilar to speaking to a politician that needs to be re-elected in 3 or 4 years' time. And this is part of the problem. You've got everything so short-termist. There's no overarching policy. You almost want to sit all of the parties down and say, look, guys, we need a 10, 20-year plan. Otherwise, we're going to get ourselves into even more of a state than we are today. And we can do something about it. We have got the innovative ideas. We have got the solutions. We just need to be more coordinated in the way in which we approach this. But it's very difficult to get somebody to put their neck on the block, whether it's a CFO or a politician, for the same reason. It's short-termism.
Okay, and I think we're going to wrap up, but just before we do, I'll give everyone on the panel closing thoughts. 1 minute, beginning with David. Just closing thoughts.
No, I just think these are, I find it really interesting. These are clearly, I think what you said about these being very different to green bonds, I think has struck me in the sense they're very, very earmarked. Long-term assets, there's a big demand for long-term assets from pension funds. So, yeah, good take.
Yeah, I just, as I said it right at the beginning, I studied climate change here 30 years ago. I've spent 30 years trying to get anyone interested in ESG. And to be honest with you, the uptake has been extremely disappointing across pension funds, DC investors, insurance companies. They all pay lip service to it, but very, very few of them actually do this properly, even today. But, there are glimmers of hope, I suppose, in the last 2 or 3 years that things are starting to change, but it's from a low base.
Okay, Julien, closing thoughts.
I'm happy to see so many of you. I think you guys can drive the change and start to get people to think that innovation in finance and environment can really help. Financial sector has been seen as a problem. It's not. It's actually when you have the money, you have the power. And this is where we are. It's way more leverage than people think.
Yeah, can be part of the problem.
Yeah, it can be.
I finally got them to disagree. Finally, is that right?
I think just developing that a moment is that I've written quite a lot of critical books about the financial sector, including one about the crash. And as a sort of climate justice campaigns, and if we look at where civil society is at with Extinction Rebellion and the divestment campaign, there's a big gap between people that just say, leave oil and gas, lock them in the cellar, forget about them, and what's happening here, which is making them clean up. Because at the end of the day, you are still giving money to Shell and BP. And a lot of people would find that just an a priori problem. They're going to be demonstrating outside asset managers saying, why are you elongating the life of the company that is Shell? I'm not sure that we need to have a conversation between that position and what's happening here, which is, for me, put really crudely, there are good and there are bad asset managers. And somehow the civil society climate activists have got to help or force government to make the good guys win, and women, obviously. Sorry, that was very gendered. Because, this is our money as well as other people's money. And the financial sector has a lot of power, as we've just said. And what we're not doing at the moment is having a conversation about how to use that to get this transition done as quick as possible before we all fry. Yeah.
Well, someone says it's a hoax, but anyway. Sarah, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Julien. Thank you, Philip, and Dave. Thank you all very much.